Session, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. I'm ready to drop an in-depth article on this topic on my LinkedIn newsletter, Investigators Brochure. So if you're not following me on LinkedIn, go to my profile, click follow, please, and then my newsletter is right under my profile called Investigators Brochure. I'm gonna put probably this Saturday an in-depth, much more in-depth than we're going to get into here. We're going to get into some of the philosophy behind some of this from a couple books I'm reading. But everybody's always asking me, okay, well, what is it about being a generalist? How can I be a generalist? What does that even mean? So the article is going to walk you through it. You're going to start out in this space as a specialist. Like when we hire a clinical research assistant, as an example, or a clinical research assistant, soon to be coordinator, you are initially hired to be a specialist. For example, our last research assistant, we call them an admin. They're hired, their main role is pre-qualifying patients on the phone and by text, scheduling patients. So you gotta learn a little bit of the studies in order to do that. And that's it. And then later, we get them into entering data, which is very simple activity. You don't actually even need any real training. It's just data entry. Like, here's the source for this visit. Here's the EDC portion for that visit for this subject. So you got to teach them some fundamentals, like what is the subject, which studies which, what's the IE criteria. But it's basically a specialist. And a coordinator, a full-fledged coordinator, like we hire at Yuma Clinical Trials, they're more of generalists, at least from the site perspective. They're not generalists in the industry, but they're generalists at the site level. As you start doing more and more tasks, you start becoming more of a generalist within your domain. So, if you're a coordinator at a psychiatric clinic, you ultimately become a generalist for psychiatric clinical trials. If you do enough, you're going to learn about schizophrenia studies, you're going to learn about the medications for that, you're going to learn about the assessments. You become a psychiatric generalist at the site level, which is different than what you were when you got started. Now, if that same coordinator was to go work a multi-therapeutic clinic, where let's say they did respiratory, metabolic, psych, and OBGYN. That site would want to hire that coordinator because they know, hey, this person basically knows all the how-to of running psych studies. So if nothing else, we can have him or her run our psych trials. And if we need to, while they're not a specialist in respiratory, because they've never done one, they're going to understand the bigger concepts of not just how to, but they're going to understand the concepts. So you can, this is a very important point, you can understand more than you know, which is, I just came to this realization recently, so I'm having a hard time articulating it. But it's possible to understand more about something than to actually know. This is a perfect example. This person with lots of domain expertise in psychiatry, they're essentially a generalist in psychology, or in psychiatry. They come to a new clinic where psychiatry is just one of the many therapeutic areas. They know how to do that at the new clinic, but they also understand the concepts of respiratory, at least the most part, because they understand research and they understand the systems. The systems like IRT, the systems like EDC, the systems like CREO, the systems like the IRB portals. You don't need to know anything about respiratory to understand how to do that line of work. You just need to be retrained or trained on the how-to, the specific how-to of respiratory, which is a lot easier than to train someone on the concepts. So the more of those how-tos you start developing, as far as your skill set, the more of a generalist you become, the more of a robust generalist. And so far, and you can repeat this across the therapeutic areas. You can repeat this across the different phases of treatment. If you've done a phase 2, phase 3 trial in psych, other than the deep domain expertise you need to be a coordinator for respiratory or metabolic studies, you kind of know how to do the job. So you understand how to from your previous work. You just need to know a couple other things like the assessments, the medications, which you can pick up quickly, as opposed to you need like a good year to get a firm understanding of clinical research at the site level in general. So you become a generalist, more or less. You're just lacking a little bit of domain expertise in different verticals. So phase 2, phase 3, basically you understand that framework. No matter what therapeutic area, you can just apply what you already learned in psychiatry to the new stuff, and you just got to figure out the con meds and the assessments. And every study has its own nuances anyway. Same thing applies to the phases. From phase 2 to phase 3, you get to phase 1. Now you got to learn a little bit more stuff, and that's a little bit less domain expertise because it's not just learning new medications and new assessments. But phase 1 is almost like learning a new framework of how to think. Well, you need PK draws like much more often than you did in the outpatient study. Okay, so let me just add that to my repertoire. So you can actually take a person with no experience in phase 1, because they understand most of the concepts, and put them in a phase 1 clinic, and within a few weeks they should be able to figure it out. Same thing with different therapeutic area expertises. Within a few weeks they should be able to figure it out. But you can't take someone with no knowledge in clinical research and put them in any of these situations and expect in a few weeks they're going to figure it out. So you're going to specialize until you become a generalist, but you are already a generalist once you understand the comprehensive, at least from a coordinator perspective, way to handle a study. Now, it gets even more interesting when you move across, whether it's vertically or horizontally, across the different stakeholders in the industry. So we talked about sites. Now we talk about CROs and sponsors. It's very common. The most common career trajectory for a coordinator has been traditionally to become a CRA working for a CRO or a sponsor. Now, why don't they hire people with zero research experience? Well, they do sometimes, and it's kind of related to why they do it. They do it with RNs, registered nurses, occasionally, because there is some generalist that you can apply to, from at least a clinical standpoint, the new how-to of that CRO or sponsor. But it's a lot easier to train someone who has the how-to, because when you're a CRA, what is your actual job at the end of the day? It's to monitor coordinator. So it's very helpful to know what a coordinator needs to do if you're going to monitor. So you have the skill set, a lot of it, to be a CRA. And this is what I mean by being a generalist. So it's a lot easier to bring a CRC and train them to be a CRA than to bring in an RN who knows nothing about research but knows clinical stuff to be a CRA. And this is now this hypothetical person, which is not very hypothetical in our industry, is really starting to develop a robust tool set. Charlie Munger said, to a man with a hammer, everything's a nail. So this person's now developing much more than a hammer. They've got a hammer, a screwdriver, some measuring tape, some sandpaper, maybe a power drill. This is what I mean by becoming a generalist. The goal for everyone, whether you're an entrepreneur or an employee in this space, is to become a generalist, because then you always are in demand. Now, across verticals, across stakeholders, the same thing can be said too. From a site to a tech vendor. Let's use Creo as an example, because they're a sponsor. Creo hires a lot of former site workers. I've interviewed them on the channel. Nikita is one of them. Go watch the interview with her. Go connect with her on LinkedIn. She was a coordinator. She did recruitment at a site, became a generalist at that site. Creo hired her. Why? Because of that how-to knowledge that she's developed that can be easily applied to then what and then why. Because the then why is much more powerful than the how to. But you can't have a then why without having some fundamental how to. So it's a lot easier. You can understand a lot more than you can know. I've done, maybe in my 20 years of research, maybe I've been involved in 200 studies, it's fair to say. There's probably in that same time period been 2 million studies. So my knowledge of, like, in a cumulative sense of the clinical trials is only like 200 out of, let's say, 2 million studies. But I understand almost all of them. And if you throw me into any of those 2 million, I could understand more or less. With a few weeks of, I'd have to like brush up on this therapeutic area or the nuances of this study or working with this new vendor. But I understand the concept. And so you can apply this understanding to way more things where it actually has practical purpose as opposed to knowledge. This is why memorization is no longer important. It's the understanding. Knowing how is fine. You got to have some knowing how. But what's much more valuable is knowing what and being able to abstract. And in the article, I'm going to get into how humans learn and how humans think. And it gets philosophical, but I'm trying to articulate what it means to be a generalist. And then you can go from Creo, because Creo is a perfect example, because Creo gets into finance, they get into patient recruitment, they get into biz development. So you're now starting to apply your know-how to different, more verticals, more domains. So you can start going to conferences, and in the article I'm mentioning conferences because I'm a co-founder of Save Our Sites. You start going to conferences where, what do we do at conferences? For the most part, we share best practices. We share our know-how we've developed with others who have amassed their own know-how. We exchange these ideas abstractly, right? And then we all discuss, why is this important and how can we actually apply this to our situation. The sharing of ideas, it's a very human thing to do. It's very philosophical, like I said. But now you can have these conversations at these conferences on various topics. SOS covers like 20 topics at our conferences. Some people are experts in like only one or two. But most of the people there, and especially experienced site owners are very generalist people. Now, could a site owner run a CRO? Eventually, probably. It's more, you have to learn a lot more know-how there. But a lot of what you already know does apply to a lot of the important business components of a CRO and a sponsor. Which is why myself and Chris, we've had a CRO for all these years. We've helped investigators with their investigator-initiated trials. Because there's a lot of transferable skills. So you become a generalist. And I could go on, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview. Read the article. Once it's published, I'll have the link underneath. Thank you, Guru Nation. Let me know what being a generalist means to you in this space. They're the most valuable ones out there. Bye-bye.